Okay, so today we're diving into a topic that always seems to get people talking and thinking and arguing transracialism.
Yeah, it really pushes us to think about identity, like what it even means,
Mm.
how society tries to put us all in these neat little boxes, and even like the role biology plays in all of this.
For this deep dive, you didn't hold back on the source material. We've got YouTube videos, articles, Reddit threads, even some stuff from TikTok.
We got to look everywhere, right? I mean, this isn't a simple topic, so we need to get those different perspectives.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what we're aiming for with this deep dive, right? Trying to figure out how society views this whole idea of a transracial identity.
Right, like can it be a legitimate thing? Should it be accepted? All those big questions.
Exactly.
So to kick things off, I think it's worth mentioning those high-profile cases that really brought transracialism into spotlight. I'm talking about people like Rachel Dolezal and Jahira, who was formerly known as Sha King. They both identified as black, even though biologically their ancestry was white.
And the public reaction was, well, strong, to put it mildly.
Yeah, the Simon Cushing video we have, it doesn't sugarcoat it. It talks about the scorn and mockery they faced.
And that contrast is what's so interesting, right? Because we're seeing more and more acceptance for transgender identities.
So why not for transracial identities?
Exactly. That's the central question the Simon Cushing video poses, and it gets right to the heart of it.
So how does the video try to explain this difference in how we view these two types of identity?
Well, one argument it puts forward is this idea that racial oppression is unique in its, intergenerational impact. It's not just about an individual's experience, it's about the historical weight of racism that's passed down through generations.
Okay, I think I see where this is going. So the argument is that this cumulative effect of racism makes racial identity something much deeper and more complex than, say, gender identity, which might not have that same kind of historical baggage, at least not in the same way.
Yeah, that's the line of reasoning. And they use the example of those Canadian Indian residential schools where Indigenous children were taken from their families and forced to assimilate. The point is that even if someone identifies as Indigenous Canadian, if they haven't experienced that specific intergenerational trauma, their claim to that identity might be seen as less valid from this perspective.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. But then we have the For Free Do video, and it kind of throws a wrench in the whole thing.
Right, they go straight to the foundation. But what are we even talking about when we say race? Like, how do we define it?
Because it's not as simple as it might seem, is it?
Not at all. That video breaks it down, showing how race can be based on physical traits, things like skin color, hair texture, what we call phenotypes, but also genotypes, which is the underlying genetic makeup.
And then there's ancestry, genetics, migration patterns, even behavior and cultural stuff gets thrown into the mix.
It really makes you realize how messy and complicated this whole concept of race is. And the video makes a strong case that historically, race has been used as this arbitrary caste system to exploit and dehumanize people.
It's about power, isn't it?
Yeah, a lot of it comes down to that.
The video also goes into how transracialism is playing out online. And they don't shy away from controversial examples. They bring up Oli London, who many see as a really extreme and attention-seeking case.
Right. And the criticism there is that their engagement with Korean identity feels very surface level. Like they're focusing on changing their appearance to look Korean, but maybe not engaging with the deeper cultural aspects.
Yeah, it's all about the aesthetic, seemingly. And the video also mentions these things called subliminals, which are like audio messages that supposedly help you manifest a different appearance, and face claiming, where people online basically adopt the persona of someone from another race.
It's almost like a digital form of trying to embody a different racial identity, right?
Yeah, I guess you could see it that way. But the video then shifts gears and asks, okay, why are so many people against transracialism? What are the main arguments?
Well, one common argument is that people claiming a transracial identity are out of touch with the lived experiences and struggles of the race they're identifying with. It's like, you haven't walked in our shoes, so how can you truly understand?
Yeah, that makes sense. And the video also mentions this perception that transracialism is kind of a trend, something mostly happening among white people in Western cultures.
Right, and that feeds into the idea that it's somehow going against the natural order of things.
But then the For Freeing video offers a counterargument. It actually defends transracialism, and it does so by appealing to these libertarian and transhumanist principles.
So it's all about individual freedom and the right to self-discovery. Their point is, as long as you're not harming anyone else, you should be free to identify however you feel is right for you.
Okay, so it's a very individualistic perspective. Now let's jump over to the Professor Dave Explains video. This one throws in an interesting wrinkle by saying that gender is a biological construct. Now, this might sound a bit odd, given how we often think of gender as being more fluid and open to change than race.
It's almost like they're flipping the script, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But I think what they're getting at is that there's a biological basis to sex, which is assigned at birth based on anatomy. And that, in turn, can influence gender identity, even if it doesn't fully determine it. But here's the thing. While race might be linked to certain physical traits, there's no universally agreed upon biological marker for race like there is for sex.
So that difference, whether race has a clear biological basis or not, becomes a big sticking point when people try to compare transgenderism and transracialism.
Exactly. It complicates that whole analogy, right? Like, if you're arguing that gender, which many see as more fluid, is rooted in biology, while race is largely seen as a social construct, then it throws a wrench in the argument that acceptance of one should automatically lead to acceptance of the other.
Totally. It's not a simple one-to-one comparison.
Yeah.
Now, the RCTA, understanding RCTA perspective, brings some different issues to the table. They're really focused on identity, self-perception, and how social pressures, especially around beauty standards, can play into all of this.
And they raise a big red flag about cultural appropriation.
Yeah, that's a key concern. When someone adopts features of another racial group without really understanding or respecting their cultural significance, it can be seen as trivializing or disrespecting that culture.
Right. It's like you're just taking the parts you find aesthetically pleasing without acknowledging the deeper meaning behind them.
Yeah.
And the RCTA perspective also connects this desire to change one's race to deeper societal issues like systemic racism and colorism.
Absolutely. The preference for lighter skin in many cultures is a clear example of this. It shows how these societal biases can lead people to want to change their appearance to align with more privileged racial categories.
Well, it's not just about individual identity. It's about these broader systems of power and inequality.
Exactly.
Now, let's turn to the Wikipedia page on race, human categorization. It gives us some really important historical context. It basically says that our modern concept of race emerged during European exploration and conquest, and it was used to categorize populations based on physical differences.
And it was during this time that the idea of distinct biological races really took hold.
Right, but here's the key takeaway. Modern science largely rejects the concept of biologically distinct races within humans. The Wikipedia entry emphasizes that the genetic differences among human populations are relatively small compared to the similarities we all share.
It's like we're all way more alike than different, genetically speaking.
Exactly. And the Wikipedia entry even points out that when scientists try to assign a race to a skeleton, it's more of a prediction based on those socially constructed categories rather than actual proof of distinct biological races.
It's super interesting how much our social ideas about race have influenced even scientific thinking.
Totally. And the Warford College video on the history of racism in science really drives this point home. It traces how scientific racism, which used flawed science to justify racial hierarchies and the superiority of white people, developed over centuries.
It's a really sobering reminder of how science has been used to support oppressive systems.
Yeah, it's a dark chapter in history, and it helps us understand why these conversations about race are still so charged today. We also have this really powerful personal account from the Black to White Transracials Reddit community. It's a post where someone talks about internalizing racism to a really intense degree, to the point where a family member expressed suicidal thoughts related to being Black. The family's response was to avoid talking about race altogether and disengage from what they call online cope culture.
Wow, that's a heavy example of how deeply racism can impact people's lives.
Right. It shows the extreme lengths some people go to escape that pain, even if their methods are controversial and not widely accepted. Then we have the Truth Unedited video, which offers a kind of alternative history lesson. It traces the origins of different human populations, but it cautions against making definitive claims about the original whiteness of Europeans. It even refutes this idea that the biblical figure Esau represents white people, pointing out that the descendants of Shem, another biblical figure, were also Black.
So it's pushing back against those simplistic narratives about racial origins and purity, right?
Exactly. It highlights how complex human migration has been and how interconnected different populations have been throughout history. It really undermines the idea that there are these pure, distinct biological races.
Yeah, like those ideas are more about mythology and ideology than actual history.
Now let's jump to the diaracial community of Reddit. There, we see someone who identifies as half Japanese, sharing their story. They talk about feeling a lifelong connection to Japanese culture, but also about being bullied for their appearance. They found some acceptance by adopting certain aspects of Japanese style and presentation, but they still grapple with feelings of not truly belonging.
It really shows how much social factors and personal experiences can play into these desires to identify with a different race. And it's interesting that this subreddit uses flares like positivity and spirituality, suggesting that there's a real search for belonging and meaning within this specific identity.
Yeah, it's not just about appearance, it's about finding a place where you feel like you fit in. And then there's Martina Big, featured on the Quote Goats podcast. She's someone who's taken really drastic measures to achieve what she calls a black look. She's undergone extensive body modifications, including skin darkening and facial surgeries. She talks about her experiences traveling and interacting with people from different backgrounds, both positive and negative.
Martina Big's story is definitely one of the more extreme examples. It raises a lot of questions about motivation and the lengths to which someone might go to embody a different racial identity. And her experiences also show how differently people react to someone who's attempting a racial transition.
Right, some people are accepting, while others are confused or even hostile. It highlights how challenging it can be to navigate these spaces when you don't fit neatly into existing categories. Now, the Remnant 777 video offers a more controversial take. They argue that historical discrimination against groups like the Irish has basically disappeared because, they claim, the Irish changed their behavior. But when it comes to black people in America, they argue that racism persists. And their conclusion is that the group facing discrimination has the power to change those negative perceptions through their own actions.
That's a very loaded argument. It puts a lot of responsibility on the victims of discrimination to change the system, rather than addressing the systemic factors that perpetuate racism.
Exactly. It's important to remember that racism is deeply embedded in our institutions and social structures. It's not just about individual attitudes.
Right, it's about power dynamics and how those dynamics have been used to maintain racial hierarchies.
Now, the Simon Cushing video on theories of racism introduces us to some philosophical heavyweights. It brings up the perspectives of Kwame Anthony Appiah and Sally Haslinger. Appiah argues that racism is inherently bad, like killing, but there might be rare circumstances where it could be justifiable.
Like maybe if someone is acting out of a sense of self-preservation because their group has been historically victimized, it's a really nuanced and controversial argument.
Yeah, it's definitely pushing some boundaries, but it shows how complex these ethical questions can get. And the video also mentions Haslanger, who proposes a way of thinking about race and gender that ties membership in a category to social treatment.
So according to Haslanger, it's not just about your ancestry or biology, it's about how society perceives you and treats you based on those factors. And that opens up some interesting possibilities for how we might think about transracial identity.
Exactly. It suggests that maybe social recognition and treatment could play a role in legitimizing a transracial identity, even if there's no biological or ancestral connection.
It's like if you're consistently treated as a member of a certain racial group and you identify with that group, does that make you a member even if you don't have the right ancestry?
Right, it's a really thought-provoking question. Now, the pilot study on transracial identity and the effect on life circumstances actually gives us some data to look at.
Right.
It found that the majority of participants had undergone body modifications to align with their identified ethnicity. We're talking about changes in hair, makeup, tanning, even cosmetic surgeries.
It shows how deeply invested these individuals are in their chosen racial identity. They're willing to make significant changes to their appearance to match how they feel inside.
Yeah, it's not just about saying, I identify as this. They're taking concrete steps to embody that identity. Interestingly, one participant felt that a full transition was impossible. Like, they couldn't fully become the race they identified with, no matter what changes they made.
Which kind of highlights the limitations of our current ability to change our physical appearance to match our desired racial identity.
Right, it's not like a sex change, where there are medical procedures to alter your body in significant ways. Now, the What is Race? Biology and Social Construction video dives into the criteria for something to be considered biologically grounded. They emphasize things like consistent data patterns, coherence, predictive power, and independent verification. They even mention these genetic clustering studies, which suggest there are only a limited number of genetic partitions in human DNA.
And those partitions don't neatly align with our social categories of race.
Exactly. which reinforces the idea that race, as we understand it, is largely a social construct, not a biological reality.
It's something we've created and imposed on the world, not something that's inherently natural or fixed.
Right, and the video really hammers home how rigorous science needs to be when establishing a biological basis for anything. Race just doesn't meet those standards.
It's more about social meaning than biological difference.
We also get a brief mention of the "Where did patriarchy come from" video. And it's there to remind us that even things like gender roles and power imbalances between men and women are social constructs that have evolved over time.
It's all part of this bigger picture of how so much of what we consider natural or fixed about ourselves and our society is actually fluid and subject to change.
Yeah, it challenges us to question those assumptions. Now, over on the Ask Transrace Reddit community, people are asking direct questions about what it means to be transracial. They're drawing comparisons to the transgender identity and trying to figure out what the defining features of this identity are. There's even a questionnaire designed to gather information about this community.
It's really interesting to see how these individuals are trying to grapple with and define their own experiences, and that comparison to transgender identity keeps coming up.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme throughout our source material. Now, the philosophical paper we have really dives into the core of the debate. They explicitly avoid taking a stance on Rachel Dolezal's case specifically, but they really try to understand the broader arguments for and against transracialism.
And they do that by drawing parallels and distinctions with transgenderism, encouraging us to approach this with curiosity rather than immediate judgment.
Right. They want us to ask how society should treat individuals who feel strongly that they belong to a different racial group.
It's about pushing beyond those knee-jerk reactions and really wrestling with the ethical implications of accepting or rejecting these claims.
Exactly. The paper tackles some common objections head-on. For example, there's this privilege argument, which suggests that it's easier for a white person to identify as black than the other way around.
Right, like there's an inherent imbalance of power there.
Yeah, and the paper addresses this by drawing parallels to potential privileges that might exist within different types of gender transitions and other forms of social inequality. They even suggest that if transracialism were to be accepted, we should consider how to ensure equal access to resources for racial transition, regardless of the direction someone wants to go in.
It's about leveling the playing field, so to speak.
Right, and they bring up Michael Jackson and Lil' Kim as potential, though complex, examples of black-to-white transitions.
Which challenges this idea that racial transition can only go in one direction, that it's always about white people trying to become something else.
Exactly. Now, the paper also introduces us to Haslanker's framework for understanding race and gender. Remember, she's the philosopher who argues that membership in a category is tied to both how society treats you and the presumed links, whether biological or ancestral, that people see in you.
Yeah, it's about both social perception and those perceived connections.
And the paper suggests that this framework could potentially include transracial individuals. Like, if society starts treating someone as if they belong to a certain racial group and they themselves identify with that group, does that make their identity legitimate, even if they don't have the right ancestry?
It's a really interesting way to think about it. It's like if you walk like a duck and quack like a duck, maybe society starts seeing you as a duck, even if you weren't hatched from a duck egg.
I like that analogy. It gets to the heart of Haslander's point. Now, the paper also highlights this interesting thing about language. The term race kind of lumps together the idea of embodiment and social role, unlike the distinction we have with sex and gender.
Yeah, it's like we're missing a word for the social aspect of race, which might make it harder to think about transracial identity in the same way we think about transgender identity.
Right, because with gender, we have separate terms to talk about the biological aspect, sex, and the social aspect, gender. But with race, it's all mashed together.
Which might contribute to the confusion and resistance we see around transracialism.
Okay, now let's move to the academic paper. They frame this whole transgender-transracial pairing as an intellectual opportunity to understand the complexities of identity politics. And they point out this fascinating paradox. We often think of sex as being more biologically based than race, but in our social discussions, it's actually sex and gender that are seen as more open to choice and change.
Like we flipped the script.
Yeah. Race and ethnicity, on the other hand, are seen as being more fixed, more tied to the body and ancestry.
Which makes it really hard to claim that you can change your race in the same way you might be able to change your gender.
Exactly. It challenges our basic assumptions about these categories. Now, the paper offers this helpful framework of thinking with trans. They break it down into 3 categories: the trans of migration, which is about moving between established categories, the trans of between, which is about defining yourself in relation to but not fully within those categories, and the trans of beyond, which is about transcending categorization altogether.
It's like a spectrum of trans experiences.
Yeah, and it's helpful because it shows that these identities aren't just simple either or shifts. They can be much more complex and nuanced.
So, with transracialism, the trans of migration might be someone moving from one racial category to another. The trans of between might be someone who identifies with aspects of multiple races but doesn't fully fit into any one category. And the trans of beyond might be someone who rejects racial categories altogether.
Right, they're trying to move past these boxes we've created. Now, the paper also discusses this argument from similarity that's used in the debate. That phrase, if Jenner, then Dolezal.
Yeah, it's basically using the acceptance of Caitlyn Jenner as a transgender woman to argue for the acceptance of Rachel Dolezal as a transracial woman.
Right, and the paper points out that this argument is used by both sides. Supporters of transracialism use it to legitimize their claims, while opponents use it to try to undermine transgender identity by saying, look, if we accept this, then we have to accept that.
It's like they're trying to use one to either bolster or discredit the other.
Exactly. And the paper also talks about this boundary work that goes on. People who want to maintain a clear distinction between transgender and transracial identities emphasize the differences they see.
So they might say that transgender identity is about an inherent sense of self, while transracial identity is more about choice. Or they might argue that transgender people are being truthful about who they are, while transracial people are being deceptive.
Right. It's about drawing these lines and saying, this is okay, but this is not.
And it often comes down to moral judgments about which identity is more authentic or legitimate.
But the academic paper brings up a really crucial difference when it comes to the social implications of race, especially in the context of racial oppression and violence. They make this powerful statement that Michael Brown couldn't be transracial.
Because he was killed for being black, right? It's a harsh reality check.
Exactly. Race carries this heavy burden of systemic oppression and violence, especially for black people. It's not something you could just choose to opt out of.
It's woven into the fabric of our society.
Right, and the paper also touches on how our understanding of intersex conditions has changed over time. It used to be common to perform surgeries on intersex infants to make them conform to typical male or female anatomy.
But now there's a growing recognition that those surgeries can be harmful and that intersex people should have the right to bodily autonomy.
Exactly. And the paper suggests that this shift might be a parallel to the growing acceptance of transgender identities.
Like, maybe our understanding of identity categories that don't fit neatly into the binary boxes is evolving.
Yeah, it's a hopeful thought. Now, the paper also observes that we use both subjectivist and objectivist accounts of identity.
So sometimes we focus on how someone feels about their own identity, and other times we look for some objective basis for that identity.
Right, like, is it about your internal sense of self, or is it about something external, like your biology or ancestry?
And both approaches have their limitations, and they're often used strategically in these debates about identity.
We also get a brief mention of the controversies surrounding transgender access to sex-segregated spaces, like bathrooms and locker rooms. But the paper points out that there aren't really comparable concerns in the transracial context. We don't see people debating whether transracial individuals should be allowed to use spaces designated for a particular race.
Which really highlights how differently we view race and gender. Like, access to race-segregated spaces isn't really a hot-button issue in the same way that access to sex-segregated spaces is for transgender people.
Yeah, it's interesting how those anxieties and debates manifest differently depending on the identity category. Now, the paper also discusses the concept of passing, which is relevant to both gender and race. And they make this important point that because of the history of racial power dynamics and inequality, identifying as black is often much more closely scrutinized than identifying as white.
Right, there's a greater fear of appropriation and a sense that someone who isn't black can't truly understand what it means to be black.
So crossing those racial boundaries, especially from white to black, is seen as much more problematic.
It's about respecting the lived experiences of those who've been marginalized and oppressed based on their race.
Finally, the paper brings us back to that trans of between idea. They give examples like drag performance, which really highlights the constructed nature of gender and the growing acceptance of multiracial identity, especially as more people discover their mixed heritage through genetic testing.
It's like we're becoming more comfortable with the idea that identity isn't always neat and tidy. There can be fluidity and complexity.
And that maybe those rigid categories we've created aren't always the best way to understand ourselves and each other.
Exactly.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the main takeaway is that the question of whether transracial identities can or should be legitimized is incredibly complex. There are no easy answers. There's so much history, so much social baggage, so much pain surrounding this topic.
Absolutely. And our exploration of these sources really shows the full spectrum of perspectives. We've got arguments for and against transracialism, we've got personal stories, we've got philosophical and scientific insights.
It's a lot to process. And ultimately, it leaves us with some big questions to ponder. If race is largely a social construct, as many of these sources suggest, then where do we draw the boundaries of racial identity? Who gets to decide who belongs and who doesn't?
And how do we balance individual freedom with the need to acknowledge and address the very real harms caused by racism and racial inequality?
Those are questions we all need to grapple with, individually and as a society. And we encourage you to keep thinking about these issues, to keep exploring these sources, and to keep having those difficult conversations.
Because the more we talk about these things, the more we can move toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and each other.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
We'll see you next time.